The Cheese and the Worms is a book written by Carlo Ginzburg and translated by John and Anne Tedeschi. It sheds a rare and almost unexplored light on the peasant culture in the 16th century, focusing on the trials of a seemingly insignificant Italian miller, Domenico Scandella, also known as Minocchio. Minocchio lived from 1532 to 1599 in the region of Friuli, in the village of Montereale, Italy. While at first glance Minocchio seemed to have a simple life, his was far from that. Ginzburg was able to piece together this book by using an extensive collection of documents covering the trials of Minocchio. These documents tell us many personal things about this not-so-average peasant, and gives us a look into the thoughts of everyday people through Ginzburg's narrations. While reading this book, it's hard not to think Minocchio's beliefs aren't ones shared by the majority of peasants, but his are actually very opposite. There are many examples of Minocchio sharing his, at the time heretical, beliefs to the discomfort of his friends. One example was given by Giuliano Stepanev when he said, no matter who his companion might be, he usually turns the conversation to matters concerning God and always introduces some sort of heresy. And then he argues and shouts in defense of his opinions. Minocchio's opinions were obviously very taboo at the time. He not only voiced his unpopular opinion often, but he changed the details of his story also. Even though his main points were always consistent, the little details eventually led to his downfall. An example of this is when Minocchio shares his version of Genesis. His original interpretation said, I have said that in my opinion all is chaos, and out of that bulk a mass formed, just as cheese is made out of milk, and worms appear in it, and these were the angels. The most holy majesty decreed that these should be God and the angels, and among that number of angels there was also God, he too having been created out of that mass at the same time. So in his first version, Minocchio mentions the world being in chaos. Later, it was changed to that in the beginning this world was nothing, and that it was thrashed by the water of the sea like foam, and it curdled like a cheese, from which later great multitudes of worms were born. And these worms became men, of whom the most powerful and wisest was God, to whom the others rendered obedience. The word chaos was replaced with a more orthodox, in the beginning this world was nothing, and the second version was also lengthier, expanding on his cheese to the worms, to men, to God sequence. Minocchio was very possibly trying to reword his interpretation to make it more church-appropriate. One of Minocchio's most threatening arguments to the church was on a topic we covered in class, the topic of truth. Minocchio argues since he was born a Christian, he would desire to remain a Christian, but had he been born a Turk, he would have wanted to remain a Turk. Ginzburg points out one very simple but important detail of his microhistory of this not-so-average miller. This was the voice of the people. While Minocchio was a little over the top for most people, he represented a view that wasn't generated by the monarchy, aristocracy, or the clergy of that time. There could have been many trials like Minocchio's that have perished or haven't been discovered yet, that represent for the first time free thinking. Not only does Ginzburg's narration shed light on the everyday life of a peasant, but also the high-class culture. We see the brutality, judgment, and narrow-mindedness of the 16th century clergy and realize their fear of this new thinking was very serious. One of the most interesting aspects to this book is the combination of different worlds it brings together. Like I mentioned, it combined the higher and lower class opinions, which is rare by itself, but it also combines written and oral traditions as well. As middle-class members of society, we owe our literacy to the printing press. Ever since its invention in the 15th century, the printing press made books more available to the masses. It is because of the printing press Minocchio learned what he did, and education wasn't only passed down through oral tradition. Ginzburg gives two examples of the people in the 16th century being more well-read and questioning their faith, or more so, the church. One is Piriogo Baroni, who claimed hell and purgatory were creations of priests to make money. And another example is Paolo Ricci, an ex-Franciscan highborn who shared many of the same heretical beliefs as Piriogo. To sum it all up,
Ginsberg demonstrates how oral and written history can cooperate together, and how both can help historians understand the other. The records from Minocchio's trials are very unique and interesting, and they are a piece of evidence that help examine 16th century Europe from different points of view. Minocchio represents a desire for change in a very Christian-dominated world, resistance of oppression, and the realization of class consciousness. Minocchio can't wholly speak for peasant or intellectual culture. Minocchio appears to be stuck between these two cultures and represents how these two worlds differ during the 16th century, creating, possibly, the first hybrid culture.